Hi there, I'm Edward Pittman. I'm a writer. I have 4 feature film scripts, thriller, horror, action drama, and drama that have got some attention in contests, and a 60-minute grounded sci-fi feature for television in pilot form called The Message that made the top 10 of the New York City International Screenplay Competition that will blow your mind. While we're all stuck inside, away from the people we really care about, I wanted to read some poems and short stories. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hi there, this time I want to read a short story. This one came to me as a dream. Anyone who wants to develop it for film or television, let me know. It's about 12 minutes long. It's called Doorways. I was taking James to a doctor's appointment. He was so thin, the kind of thin you don't come back from. He had cancer. It was terminal. And the doctors were going to explore pain strategies to try to keep him comfortable in his last days. It was a new doctor. The other one had gone on vacation. I parked the car downtown on the street and we walked toward a squat 4-story building. The architecture was different than the buildings around it. It was older, dark brick, with rust dripping down from the corroded window frames onto the brick. The modern buildings around it towered over it. All the windows had pull-down blinds and they were all drawn, so you couldn't see inside. In front of it, there was a sign saying the building was scheduled for demolition. James walked very slowly as we made our way toward the building. A couple of times he had to stop and hold on to my arm for support. Standing there, catching his breath, he'd look at me out of the corner of his eyes. For confirmation of his condition or reassurance, I couldn't say. His clothes hung on him like rags on a scarecrow. It was hard to see him like that. I wondered how much time he had. I opened the door and James walked inside. We were in a long, narrow lobby with tiny tiles all over the floor, blank walls and overhead fluorescent lights. At the end of the hallway was a single ornate white door, like an old hotel door with a gold doorknob on it. "Where are you supposed to go?" I asked. "4th floor, he said. "Guess we go through here," I said. I turned the doorknob and opened the door, and we walked inside. On the other side of the door was a small room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. The floor was covered with dark red carpet. On each of the 3 walls was another ornate white door with a gold doorknob. "What the hell?" he said. "Where do we go now?" I asked. "Try that door over there, and I'll try this one here in the middle," he said. "There's got to be an elevator here somewhere." I walked over to the center door and opened it. It opened to another 10 by 10 room, and each wall had a single ornate white door on it with a gold knob. I backed out of the room and turned around to see what James had found. Across the first room, the door was closed. I didn't see him anywhere. I walked over and opened the door. "Where are you?" I called out. There was no response. "James, are you in here?" Nothing. He was gone. I opened the door he'd gone through and looked inside. A small 10 by 10 room with 3 doors. I was starting to panic. "James, where are you? James, what door did you go through?" Nothing. The building was completely silent. I walked across the tiny room and opened the door to the right. Inside was a small room set up like an office. There were parakeets everywhere, all different colors, all chirping. It was very loud. On the desk, the parakeets were jumping across papers, across an old telephone, across a typewriter that had a half-finished page in it. There were parakeet droppings everywhere. It was clear they'd been in there for many years. A thick layer of parakeet droppings covered almost everything in the room. I closed the door and turned to the other 2 doors. I ran over and opened the door that had been on the left, a 10 by 10 room. I slammed the door and opened the door in the center. Inside was a 10 by 10 room that looked like a doctor's office waiting room. An elderly man in a dark suit was sitting in a chair, reading a magazine. "Hello," I said. "Have you seen my friend?" The man looked up. "I've been reading," he said, "but he might have come through." "What is this place?" I asked. The man smiled. "I'm waiting," he said, "but you're welcome to go on." I walked across the room to the other side, where a white door with a gold knob was set into the wall. I opened the door, and inside was another 10 by 10 room with a door on each wall. "James, where are you?" I called out. "Are you in here?" I walked into the small room and stood there listening. There was no noise from anywhere, no buzz from the fluorescent lights overhead, no sound of people moving around, no sound of machinery, no electrical hum or sound of water. I opened the door to the left. Inside, two little boys and a little girl were playing a board game on the floor. It was definitely a kid's room. The walls were painted with bright colors, and there were toys everywhere. The kids looked up. "Hi there," I said. "What are you all doing?" The oldest one, a boy, stood up, eyeing me. "Waiting for my mom," he said. "She'll be here in a few minutes. Who are you?" "I'm looking for my friend James," I said. "Have you seen him come through here? He's pretty sick. I'm worried about him." The little girl looked up at me. "Is he going to die?" she asked. I bit my lip, trying not to cry. "Yes," I said. "He's going to die." She nodded, satisfied with my answer, and picked up a small, skinny doll, dangling it upside down by its legs. "Then I hope you find your friend," she said. "You're going to want to say goodbye." The older one, who was standing, smiled a sad smile, then sat back down to continue the game with the other kids. I backed out of the room, closed the door, and turned around, walking across the room. I opened the door back to the waiting room and looked inside. Not possible. The waiting room was gone, and in its place was another 10 by 10 room with 3 doors. I dashed straight across the room to open the door on the opposite wall. Inside was a furnace room. It was unbearably hot. Old cast iron pipes snaked overhead, and puddles of rust-tinted water littered the stained concrete floor. I closed the door and turned to the door to my left. When I opened it, it looked like the same small office from before, but all the parakeets were gone, and there were no parakeet droppings. The room was completely clean, and the piece of paper was gone from the typewriter. I wondered what it had said. In the center of the desk was a single bright yellow parakeet feather, the only thing to let anyone know the parakeets had ever been there at all. I turned around and opened the door to the room with the children, but of course they were gone. In their place was another 10 by 10 room with 3 doors. I quickly went to the door to the right and flung it open. 2 old women, both with gray buns centered on top of their heads, were inside, sitting in rocking chairs, knitting. Knitted pieces were piled on a small table and tacked onto the walls. There were quilts, pot holders, and stacks of sweaters for people of all sizes. "Hello," I said. "How are you?" "We're fine," one said, "but you're a bit early. We won't have tea for another hour or so." I looked around the walls. There was no clock, and they weren't wearing watches. "What time is it?" I asked. They stopped knitting and looked at each other. One of them thought about it for a moment, then turned to look up at me. "That's a very good question," she said. A worried look crossed her face, and she looked like she might cry. The other one reached over to put her hand on her arm to calm her. The first woman smiled, shrugged her shoulders, and went back to knitting. Then they were both knitting, faster and faster, so I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. I opened the last door and walked inside another 10 by 10 room. I walked straight to the door on the left and flung it open. Inside was a middle-aged woman in yoga clothes, her hair in a braided ponytail. She was sitting on a yoga mat in the middle of what looked like a small yoga studio with a wooden floor. "Hello," she said. "Are you here for the class?" "I'm not sure," I said. "I don't recognize you," she said. "If it's your first time, there's some paperwork you need to fill out." "I'm looking for a friend of mine," I said. "His name is James. He's about my age and he's wearing a black jacket. Have you seen him?" "I haven't seen him," she said, smiling. "You haven't seen anyone?" "No," she said, "no one." "When was the last time you saw someone?" I asked. She was thinking. And as she thought, what had once been a smile turned into a frown, then concern. "I don't think I've seen anyone for a long time," she said. Then she caught herself. "Do you still want to fill out that paperwork?" she asked. "It's a beginner class. I think you'll fit right in." "Maybe later," I said. "Right now, I need to find my friend. Good luck with your classes." She brightened. "Thanks," she said. I left and was back in the 10 by 10 room. On one wall was a large television monitor. I must not have noticed it before. Pictured in the monitor was a 10 by 10 room with 3 doors. James walked into view. "James," I yelled, "can you hear me?" On the television screen, James didn't respond. He can't hear me, I thought. I watched as James walked toward the door in the center of the wall, opening it. Through the doorway, I could see a beautiful meadow, the afternoon sun shining on a green hillside. I could hear the sound of birds calling from far off, the quiet rush of the breeze through trees. There were mountains in the distance. James leaned on the doorframe to steady himself, then walked through the doorway and closed the door behind him. And then he was gone, the television showing an unchanging picture of the room with the 3 doors. Noise everywhere, a terrible crashing sound, huge blocks of concrete falling, the shrieking of twisting steel. They were demolishing the building. I had to get out. I ran through door after door after door after door as fast as I could, seeing crazy things as I went. A room filled with chittering raccoons. A room with a string quartet playing Bartok at a furious pace. A room with a small orange cat sitting on a pillow in the center of the room, raising a single paw in a gesture that I knew was somehow significant. A room with what looked like a cloud floating in midair, light flickering from inside. As I closed the door, light flashed from under the door, followed by a booming thunderclap. Door after door after door, until finally I flung open one door as the sound of the crashing building was right behind me, and there in front of me was the city street. I leapt through the doorway just in time, rushing across the street, blending into the crowd, then turning to watch the last of the building collapse, an immense cloud of dust boiling where the building used to be. Then the wind kicked up, carried the cloud of dust up into the sky, and it was over. Everyone turned away and walked off in different directions down the streets. It was time to go home, but my car was on the other side of the rubble. The line of buildings seemed to go on forever, and I just couldn't get there. So I walked down the stairs and got on the train. I got into the car just in time, and then the train took off. As the train lurched along the tracks, I saw her from behind, the long braided ponytail, a small cloth bag hung over her shoulder. I knew it was her. I stepped forward. I couldn't believe that something from the building had survived. I wanted some kind of explanation. The train entered a tunnel, and for a moment the train car was dark. I was afraid that when the light returned, she wouldn't be there. But when we came out of the tunnel, daylight filled the car and she was still sitting there. I walked up behind her. She turned to look at me, smiling the widest smile I'd ever seen. "Hello again," she said.